My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. In December of 1990, the band Styx released a song written by lead singer and keyboardist Dennis DeYoung. Within the song was the lyric, "And as I slowly drift to sleep, for a moment dreams are sacred. I close my eyes and know there's peace in a world so filled with hatred. Then I wake up each morning and turn on the news to find we've so far to go. And I keep on hoping for a sign, so afraid I just won't know." That song was called "Show Me the Way," and the lyric is as meaningful and real today, and perhaps even more so, than it was 25 years ago. Is there a way that all of us, people from every culture, nationality, and faith, can return to understanding, compassion, real stewardship of this world we share, and brotherly and sisterly love? Is there a way to God? My guest this evening, Matthew Fox, says there is a way, through creation spirituality. Matthew is an internationally acclaimed theologian, spiritual maverick who has spent the last 40 years revolutionizing Christian theology, taking on patriarchal religion, and advocating for a creation-centered spirituality of compassion, justice, and resacralizing the earth. Originally a Catholic priest, he was silenced for a year and then expelled from the Dominican Order by then Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict the 16th. He was expelled for teaching liberation theology and creation spirituality. He found what he calls religious asylum within the Episcopal Church. He's the author of more than 30 books, which have sold more than 1.5 million copies in 60 languages. You can visit him at www.matthewfox.org, and tonight we'll be discussing his latest book, A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation Spirituality Journey. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Fox. Good evening, Matthew.
Good evening, Victor. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are very blessed to have you on our show this evening.
I'm looking forward to it.
Well, let's start at the beginning, sir. Let's start at the beginning, your beginning. What was youth like for Matthew Fox, and how did it lead to your vocation as a priest?
Well, I was one of 7 children. I was in the middle, the neurotic middle, they tell me. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a Midwesterner. And my family was practicing Catholic, and went to public high school, and my friends were heavily Protestant or agnostic or Jewish. So we had a lot of good philosophical debates, and I would go to my parish priest, who was a Dominican, and get books to read to argue back at these philosophical discussions. So I enjoyed that intellectual side of life. And when I was a senior, I did a retreat with the Dominicans, and I liked what I saw. So I decided to join them a couple years after college, and after a couple years of college. So I became a Dominican, and I liked that tradition because it had an intellectual side to it, and Madison is a university town, and that was important to me. But it also had an aesthetic side because there was a community life, and the prayer was chanting quite a lot, the office of the Psalms and so forth. So all that appealed to me, and the community life as well. So that's what I did until I was the year of my ordination. I told my superiors that they should send someone on to get a degree in spirituality. I said my generation would be less interested in religion, more interested in spirituality. Spirituality being the experiential side of religion. And they said, well, fine, where should you go? So I wrote Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk, and he sent me a letter back a few days later saying, go to Paris, the Institut Catholique in Paris. Well, I eventually got there. the Dominicans didn't want to send me. They said, we never sent anyone to France who came home again, they said. But I did come home, and then they regretted that a little bit, too, later down the pike. But so I owe Thomas Merton all the trouble I've gotten in since, you see.
I understand. Now, when did you first become aware of creation spirituality?
Well, growing up in Wisconsin, I think it was the closeness to nature and the seasons, of course. You had 4 very hefty seasons in Wisconsin back then before climate change really hit. And also the Native American presence was very strong. I had Native American dreams when I was a child, a lot of them. And so I think all that had a lot to do with my appreciation of the experience of God in nature. And we got kind of some mixed messages in my training, and that's one reason I wanted to study spirituality, was to kind of sort this out. And it was in Paris that I met my mentor, Père Chanou, a wonderful French Dominican theologian, who named this creation spiritual tradition for me. And it made all the sense in the world, because the other tradition, which is the dominant tradition in Christianity, is the Augustinian tradition. It's very dualistic, and it separates body from soul and matter from spirit, and it's also dualistic toward women. And that's what fundamentalism in all of its forms follows, that path, whereas the creation spiritual path is the oldest path in the Bible. It's the J source of Genesis. It's a path of wisdom tradition, which is the tradition that Jesus himself came from, and that's a nature-based religion, spiritual experience, more than book-based, really.
Now, when you say the J source, we're referring to what's known as the Jahweh or the Yahweh text. Is that correct?
Yes, right. In Genesis, that's right, yeah.
And just for our listeners who are not familiar with this, just explain a little bit about that and how that started the foundation of what eventually became the Pentateuch or the Torah.
Well, you find creation spirituality in the wisdom tradition, which of course is the Song of Songs, the Psalms, the Book of Wisdom, the Book of Sirach, which the Catholic Church holds as biblical, and Ecclesiastes, and so there's a lot of books that are especially poetic that are the basis of the wisdom tradition in Israel. Of course, the prophets too have a very strong flavor of poetry. And the greatest poets in the world are Isaiah and Hosea and others there. So that too overlaps, really. The wisdom tradition actually came kind of late. It came after the prophetic tradition, but it incorporated the prophets. It says in the Bible, wisdom is a friend of the prophets. So it incorporated that sense of justice and so forth, but it put it in a broader context of all the religions of the world. So that the wisdom tradition has always been ecumenical, because nature is not divided by Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and atheism. As I say, there's no such thing as a Roman Catholic rainforest and a Lutheran sun and a Baptist moon,
yes,
and an atheist cornfield. So once we reset religion in the context of nature and creation, religions learn a little humility. And that's a real important thing to learn, I think, especially for religions. And especially at this time when, of course, the earth is under so much stress due to human narcissism and anthropocentrism.
Now, how did the works of Meister Eckhart and Thomas Merton influence your own work?
Well, I did read Merton's autobiography called Seven Story Mountain when I was a 16-year-old or so. And it was a big seller. He wrote it in 1948 after he joined the Trappist monastery in 1940. But it was a real big seller in America. It sold millions of copies. And it was about contemplation and all that, and that was the strong part. Although it was quite heavily dualistic and guilt-ridden and Augustinian. But in 1958, he started dialoguing with Dr. Suzuki, the Japanese Buddhist who brought Zen to America. And Suzuki told him, read your one Zen thinker of the West, Meister Eckhart. Well, Merton set out and did that, and it changed him. He really changed 180 degrees. But from being this kind of dualistic and guilt-ridden monk of the 40s and 50s to being a much more prophetic figure. And his writings also were much more ecumenical, more interfaith. So he was writing about Buddhism then in the 60s and about war and the Vietnam War. He was the first figure in America to come out against the Vietnam War. And he was a very fine, acute critic of both culture and religion, because he also writes about fundamentalism. He calls this the greatest idolatry of all time, the connection of fundamentalism with right-wing politics. And he's a very fierce and acute critic of culture and of religion, too.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Meister Eckhart for those of our listeners who are not familiar with him. Who was he, and what was his work like?
Meister Eckhart was a Dominican also, like I was, and he was condemned a week after he died by a scurrilous pope, Pope John the 22nd, and he died in 1329, the early 14th century. So he lived the late 13th, early 14th century. He was a German, and he worked and studied in Paris for many years at the University of Paris, and he was very much a friend of the women's movement of the time, the Béguine movement, and for that he was under suspicion, because the Pope had forbidden Dominicans to work with Béguines, because Béguines were not nuns and they were not married. They were creating a lifestyle in between, and this was considered threatening by a lot of the patriarchy of the time. But he nevertheless stood side by side with the Béguines. He also stood with the peasants. He was the first intellectual, the first theologian to preach in German of the day. And German in that time was the dialect of the peasants. And he's the first intellectual to kind of gather it and use it for theology. And we found the transcripts of his trial in the 19th century, and one of the accusations was this. They said, "Why are you preaching to the poor people in their own language? If you would go back and preach in Latin, we'd let you go, because you're disturbing the poor people, telling them that they're all sons and daughters of God." And this confuses them.
Oh, my. And we're going to get back to that message and more with our guest, Matthew Fox, after these messages on Destination Unlimited.
Have you ever wondered how to change your love paradigm? The secret key is finding a love partnership, not just a regular connection. How do you find these? Through conscious relationships. Ascending Hearts Dating is a dating site for people like you that believes in second chances and a different type of spiritual connection. Try Ascending Hearts for free today at ascendinghearts.com and change your love paradigm. Ascending Hearts, the premier dating community for the spiritually awake.
Hi, this is Sylvia Henderson, intuitive life coach and energy healer. Are you ready to elevate and rise way above your normal? Be sure to listen to my show, Intuitive Transformations, on OMTimes Radio, Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern. Get the inspiration you need to transform your life.
I want to thank my mommy for loving me so much,
for taking me to the doctor when I broke my foot, for leaving me alone when I wanted to be alone.
And now, as a grown-up, I'm thankful for being able to take care of you, my dear mom, for taking you to your therapies, for understanding that sometimes you simply want to be alone.
Roles change without us noticing. That's why AARP gives you the information to provide even better care for your loved one. Visit aarp.org/caregiving. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Continuing our discussion with Matthew Fox, author of A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation Spirituality Journey. We were talking in the first segment about Meister Eckhart and his influence on the work that you do. And you had mentioned that he was actually being persecuted for giving the common folk of the day the concept that they were sons and daughters of God. That's so strange.
Well, it is, and yet look at a lot of religion today. It's not teaching people that they are other Christs, which is what Eckhart was saying and what a lot of the tradition says. It's busy talking about sin all the time and keeping people down. And That's the difference. Part of creation spirituality is to put original blessing out front instead of original sin. And that makes all the difference in the world. If you're going to run an empire, original sin is a great idea. And that's precisely when original sin came up. Augustine came up with the idea in the 4th century when Christianity inherited an empire. So, but really the idea of original blessing, that all beings are good, including humans, this is the tradition of creation spirituality. And Meister Eckhart had his interpretation of that, and Hildegard of Bingen and other great mystics did. And Merton, too. I take that subject up in my book here on Merton. So it makes all the difference in the world, doesn't it? Whether you're encouraged to take joy and pride in your existence, or whether you're to get on your knees for your whole life and do penance for your sins.
Absolutely. Many years ago, in my late 30s, I was going through what you might refer to as the dark night of the soul and questioning a lot of things in my life. And I would attend these salons at a wonderful woman's house here in New York City. She was probably in her late 80s, early 90s at the time, and I was in my late 30s. And she looked upon me with a very motherly aspect, and she saw that I was troubled. And she came over to me after one of these salon evenings and said, "May I share something with you?" And I said, "Absolutely." And she said, God does not require that we be holy, but God would love for us to be whole. And her saying that to me changed my life. This concept of embracing who we are as we are and moving forward, knowing that, changed my life.
That's a beautiful, beautiful moment indeed.
Absolutely. So how does the work of Meister Eckhart and Thomas Merton and Hildegard von Bingen and the rest of those folks, the mystics as you call them, how does that manifest in creation spirituality?
Well, I name it through what we call the 4 paths. And so in this book on Merton, I show that each of these paths is very rich in Merton. The first path is the via positiva. That's a way of what Rabbi Heschel calls radical amazement, of awe and wonder and gratitude and reverence. And I think we're all subject to that, especially in nature, where we are moved by the beauty of everyday existence and of our place in the universe. Then the via negativa is a path of silence and solitude, but it's also the path of a broken heart, of grieving, of the dark night of the soul that you spoke of. And that, too, is a breakthrough moment for many people. That Meister Eckhart says, in a breakthrough, I learned that God and I are one. And then the third path is the via creativa. That's creativity. Because when you've fallen in love, which is the via positiva, and then you've learned to let go, which is the via negativa, then you're ready to give birth to something. You're ready to bring your being, your wisdom, your vocation into the world. And that's creativity. And that's a mystical experience for many people. When you're in a highly creative state, you're not looking at your watch, you're not daydreaming so much as you're being taken along for the ride by the power of creativity, the spirit, great spirit. And then the fourth path is the via transformativa. That's the way of justice and compassion. And that becomes really the test of creativity, because obviously we can use our creativity to create gas ovens, to destroy our made-up enemies, or to destroy rainforests in a day that has taken God and nature 10,000 years to give birth to. So justice has to come in here as the real guide and direction for our creativity. Those 4 paths, I think, name the deep spiritual journey. Rabbi Heschel says there's, in the recesses of every human existence, a prophet. And the 4th path is that prophet. It's our interfering with injustice. It's standing up for justice, whether eco-justice, racial justice, economic, social justice. All that is prayer also. So those 4 paths name the contemplative side of life and the active side of life. And we need to marry the two, especially at this time in history. And that's what I love about Merton, that he had both, even though he was obviously a deep contemplative as a monk, living often in solitude and in a hermitage. He also was activist with his pen, with his writing, And a lot of activists came to him for support. For example, Daniel Berrigan and his brother Philip. And Daniel died 2 weeks ago at 94 years of age. He was an activist who went to jail often during the Vietnam War because he was protesting nonviolently the militarism in America. And so you have this, we have people who incarnate the active and the contemplative. And Meister Eckhart was such a person too. And I think people are really hungry for this today, especially young adults.
Absolutely. It's we're going to talk more about the four paths in a later segment in the show, but it's interesting to me how these, in some aspects, mirror the various forms of yogic study and yogic practice.
That's very interesting. Certainly, karma yoga is, of course, a path of service.
Yes,
and that would be the via transformativa.
Right, path of service, the path of devotion. The path of contemplation, absolutely. So this is something that truly is universal in its concept.
It is. It's archetypal, and I've seen it applied to so many aspects of life and of scholarship too. One of my students on graduate from our program went on and got a doctorate in English literature, and he did his doctorate thesis on Walt Whitman. And he applied the four paths to Walt Whitman, and he got an A++ for his thesis.
and so true, and absolutely true, because Whitman was an exponent of all of these qualities.
Exactly, and it helped to bring out the depth of Whitman. We had a course taught by a musician who just loved to listen to music, and he would teach courses on Mahler as a spiritual director, and he would show the four paths in Mahler's music, and the four paths in Mozart, and in Wagner, and in Beethoven and so forth. It's a marvelous way to go deeper and to realize in the West, art is often a yoga. The musicians are yogis, and they are leading us into deep spiritual experience and awakening, and we should realize that. And this helps to name that archetypal path and journey.
Absolutely. Getting back to your own path, you had the blessing of friendship and guidance from Thomas Merton. Please share what that experience was like.
Well, I never met him personally, but we did correspond. And so in my book, I have a whole chapter on the letter he wrote me, and I kind of exegete it. And in some ways, I kept my distance a little bit after he died because I felt that the monastery was kind of creating a Merton factory. They were turning out so many of his books, it kind of was overwhelming. And I just kept a little distance. And so that's why this book was very fun for me to do, because here I'm now in my mid-70s, and I realized that Merton and I went parallel paths, very close, that he too found Eckhart as pivotal. As he used to write, he used to say, Eckhart is my lifeboat, Eckhart is my lifeboat. And I discovered Eckhart on my own, not through Merton, but Eckhart also was extremely important to me because the great spiritual tradition I was trying to unfold and share with others, it was marvelous to see someone like Eckhart who was so deeply immersed in this very same journey. So in some ways, it was Merton, Eckhart, and myself that I find we're traveling together down the same path, but obviously with different personalities and backgrounds.
You talk about being mystic or the mystical path. What is a mystic?
A mystic is a lover. It's a lover in all of us. We're all mystics. At least we were when we were born. Sometimes it gets beaten out of us by education and religion and a few other trippy things. But the truth is, the mystic is one who's vulnerable to being struck by awe. The mystic is the child in us, the puer or the puella, who is still young enough and vulnerable enough to get excited about life and to be curious about life and to seek out what's beauty and not to allow oneself to be overwhelmed by the burdens of life and the failures and the struggles and the losses. But again, as I mentioned earlier, that's the dark night of the soul, isn't it? So the mystics go to the edge, and the edge of joy, but also the edge of darkness and suffering. And they invite us to go to the edge too. There's a great line from John the Cross, a 16th century Spanish mystic. He says, "Launch out into the deep." And I think that's real powerful archetypal language again, the deep. We all have the depths inside of us, but I think most of us are taught to stay on the shore. we don't want to launch out. And I think religion in general, the churches in general at this time in history, are very tepid. We talk about Wall Street being too big to fail, and the banksters being too rich to jail. Well, I think a lot of religion is too tepid to sail. We're not being invited to sail out into the deep, to explore the depths of our consciousness and of our possibilities. But the mystics are out there saying, "Come on in, the water's fine," and this is what life is about. It's about experiencing things in depth, not just staying on shore or staying with the superficial.
Absolutely. Do you think that our modern, digitally based technological society has drawn people away from that mystic?
Well, that's very interesting. Merton was a real critic of technology in his day, and the big deal in his day was getting a man to the moon. He died a year before it happened. But he says, what good is it to send someone to the moon? After all, he said, ants can fly. Well, what good is it to send someone to the moon if we don't first examine the human soul? Because if we don't, we will be bringing our problems still to the moon and beyond. We'll be circling Venus with all of our anxieties, he said, if we don't start dealing with our anxieties. So he said this is a much bigger discovery than getting to the moon, namely examining who we are as a species. Now, he wrote that about 60 years ago. Imagine if we had kind of taken him up on that, how much wiser today we'd be as a species, and much less dangerous to ourselves and to other beings on this planet.
My guest is Matthew Fox. He's the author of the new book, A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation, Spirituality Journey. Matthew, please tell our listeners how they can get your book, and find out more about you.
Well, of course, they can go online. I'm sure Amazon has it and others. They can go to bookstores, but you can go to my webpage too, MatthewFox.org. Very simple, 2 T's, Matthew, and you could get the book that way too.
And we'll be back with more of Matthew Fox and this wonderful wisdom of Thomas Merton after these messages on Destination Unlimited.
This is OTR-FM, part of the IOM radio network.
Are you in an interfaith relationship and thinking of getting married? For 18 years, Reverend Laurie Sue Brockway has been creating personalized, loving, and romantic ceremonies for couples of all faiths and cultural backgrounds. Reverend Laurie Sue's sensitivity to the needs of interfaith couples is reflected in the compassionate and inclusive way she addresses the concerns of parents and families. Reverend Laurie Sue is also the author of several best-selling books on interfaith weddings and wedding vows. Selected as one of the top interfaith officiants by New York Magazine, Reverend Laurie Sue serves couples in the New York metropolitan area and beyond. Find out more at her website, yourinterfaithwedding.com.
OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hi, this is Carly Simon for Lifebeat. The music industry fights AIDS. The AIDS crisis isn't over. There have been amazing scientific breakthroughs, but people are still dying, and your local AIDS organization needs your help more now than ever. Volunteer and make a difference.
And we're back on Destination Unlimited. My guest this evening is Matthew Fox, author of A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation, Spirituality Journey. We mentioned in your biography in the beginning of the program that Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict the 16th, expelled you from the Dominican Order. Why did he do that?
Well, he accused me of 7 heresies, I guess he thought they were. And I take them up in this book on Merton, and I invite Merton into the docket with me because, frankly, I think he was teaching the same thing I was teaching. So the first is that he said I was a feminist theologian. and I didn't know that was a heresy. I still don't think it is. In fact, Jesus was a feminist. It's one of the outstanding dimensions to his life and his teaching was how he elevated the role of women. The second objection was that I call God Mother. Well, goodness, I mean, Isaiah 42 calls God Mother, but also all the great mystics of the Middle Ages call God Mother. Hildegard did, and Mechtilde Magdeburg, and Eckhart, and others. The third objection was that I prefer original blessing to original sin. We've already touched on that, and I certainly do. I think original sin is bad psychology, bad sociology, and it's bad theology. Jesus never heard of original sin. No Jews ever heard of original sin. What are we doing chasing after original sin and saying that Jesus is inspiring our chase? Makes no sense at all. Fourthly, I don't condemn homosexuals. And of course not. Science has spoken. This is a Galileo case of our time. Are we going to wait 400 years this time too for religion to come around to what science has made clear, that there's going to be about an 8% population of gay and lesbians anywhere in the world, and this is how it is. So we should recognize the diversity of people and of sexuality and get on with it. So, and then another objection was that I worked too closely with Native Americans. Now, I have no idea what that really means, except that I did have a Native American on my faculty, a couple of them, in fact. I think it's very important to learn from the most ancient traditions of the planet, and especially because their spirituality is so built around, of course, the respect for Mother Earth. And so I had a faculty member, a Lakota man, who had sweat lodges on our campus, and at the time it was a Catholic liberal arts college, Holy Names College in Oakland, so I guess that upset the Vatican. So those were the objections, and I don't think any of them hold water, and as I say, Thomas Merton really is on my side in all of those situations. Just for example, he wrote a whole book on Native Americans called My Name is Ishi, and he's very strong in it about the abuse and the genocide, that's his word, the genocide toward indigenous people that was launched by the Europeans and the European missionaries in the Americas. And he was very outspoken about that. In fact, he has an amazing poem about it where he talks about, let me share that with you, about the... Here, this is and he wrote this poem in his last year, 1968. Redneck captains with whips, fire in their fingers, friars behind every rock, every tree, doing business, bargaining for our souls, book burners and hang men. So you see, Merton did not let the church or its missionaries off the hook. He was as severe a critic of religion as he was of culture itself.
Absolutely. And of course, your dismissal, your expulsion from the Dominican Order and the Church. In retrospect, was this a blessing in disguise?
It was a bit like throwing me in that there briar patch, I guess, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because quite frankly, your pursuit of what you did in the path that's led you to where you are today may have been inhibited by remaining within the Church.
Well, that's true, because at that time, especially under the two popes, John Paul II and Benedict the Sixteenth, the Church took giant steps backward. They brought the Inquisition back. And I wrote a book about this called The Pope's War, in which I really lay out the facts of what went on in that 34-year dual papacy. And the facts are not at all pretty. I was only one of 106 theologians who were silenced or expelled or in some way beaten up. Some of them died of heart attacks. They were under so much pressure under those two papacies. It was a dumbing down of the church. And that explains a lot of the pedophile priest cover-up as well, that they appointed only yes men as bishops and cardinals, and the result was you had these ignorant people with no conscience being asked to respond to the pedophile crisis of priests, and they didn't have a clue. So the dumbing down of the church had profound ramifications, and the pedophile crisis and its cover-up is one big example. And you'll notice now that churches are so empty. I think it was last year that the Diocese of New York City shut down over 100 churches, and that's not the last of it. And this is happening all over the country. So the young people are just not buying into institutional religion. It's lost a great deal of its legitimacy because of this dumbing down of the church and this bringing back of the Inquisition that was done under those two popes.
Do you find that Pope Francis is turning some of this around?
Well, he's trying to. I don't think, frankly, that they can reform the organization itself. I think it's just too far gone. And they've appointed, you see, 34 years is a long time. Think of it in terms of the Supreme Court. If you pack it with right-wing people with very little intellectual or acumen or conscience, this will go on for decades because that's how long people are in places of power. So I admire Pope Francis. In fact, I quote him in the back of my book because he invoked Thomas Merton when he was giving the speech to Congress, and I certainly appreciate his encyclical Laudate Si, which in fact was written by one of my graduates of one of my programs. Actually, at least 80% of it was. But I don't think he can actually change the church internally that much. Notice how much fierce backlash there is coming from not just right-wing lay people, but a lot of right-wing clerics as well and hierarchy who were bathed in the theology, so-called, of extreme right-wing Catholicism under those two popes. So I wouldn't bet any money on the church as we know it flourishing. I think, in fact, the Holy Spirit's behind all this. I think the Holy Spirit gave the world two bad popes in a row in order to end the church as we know it in a structural form, so that we can return to a more authentic and simple expression of the teaching of Jesus and the Christ that followed. And I think that that's what's really going on. I think that people are looking for the real thing and not for the 2,000 years of accretions in the name of institutional churchiness.
So why did you name your latest book, A Way to God?
Well, in his letter to me, Merton used that phrase, and there was a great paragraph. Merton, as you can sense, is a really good writer. He's a poet, and he's very good with language. His parents were both artists. They met, in fact, his mother was from America, his father from New Zealand, and they met in Paris at the Art Institute and fell in love. And Merton was born in southern France. But he says, I'm glad you're working on spiritual theology. I do think we are lying down on the job when we leave others to investigate mysticism while we concentrate on more practical things. What people want of us, after all, is the way to God. So I took that phrase, the way to God, and just altered it to a way to God to be a little more humble. And I used that as a title of the book. And I think it speaks both to Merton's passion, because he wrote that to me in the year before he died, 1967, and to my own.
Now, you had mentioned before about the four paths. Let's review those for our listeners. And then my question to you is, wasn't Jesus a representation of each of those paths?
That's a good question. Yes, I think Jesus was indeed. So the first path is the path of awe and wonder and joy and delight. And I'm thinking right now of Jesus saying, look at the lilies of the field, that they're more splendid than the robes of Solomon and so forth. So that would be a good example from Jesus' mouth, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And that was the via positiva.
Yes. Then the via negativa is a path both of solitude and silence, but also the path of grieving and of letting go. And of course, the crucifixion event would be an example of that path in the life of Jesus, his being crucified by the empire.
Absolutely.
And then the via creativa is the path of creativity. And of course, the resurrection stories are certainly about new life and about the triumph of creativity over death, Easter Sunday versus Good Friday. So I think that's a good example. But also Jesus himself chose the art of storytelling, of creating parables to teach his message. So he himself was an artist, no question about it. And he chose that way of communicating with people, and it's a way that involves others, because parables aren't moral lessons. They're invitations. They're more like theater. They're invitations to get on board and to figure it out for yourself. That's what a parable is. So Jesus himself was an artist, and the whole power of creativity is so strong in the scriptures. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican who preceded Eckhart, he has this great line. He says, "The same spirit who hovered over creation at the beginning hovers over the mind of the artist at work." So that's just such an affirming note on the vocation of the artist, that creativity is still going on. It didn't start with the launching of the fireball. It's been going on ever since, and certainly with humans as well. We're on board for that. And then the fourth path, the path of justice and compassion, the via transformativa. Clearly, this is what got Jesus in trouble, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That he stood up to the empire of his day, and he paid the price, and he didn't back down. And he also stood up to religious abuse in his day and did not back down. And he had many lessons, didn't he, about the Sabbath is for people, not people for the Sabbath, and so forth. So he took on both the political forces, the empire, and some stodgy religious, patriarchal imperialism, if you will, and he paid a price for it. So I think, yes, these are the four paths, and they do play well in helping us to grasp the journey that Jesus took as well.
And of course, in the Via Transformativa, Jesus was definitely exemplary of not only compassion and healing, but celebration and love. And we'll be back with more of Matthew Fox, author of the new book, A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation Spirituality Journey, after these messages from the OMTimes Radio Network.
As difficult as it is to believe, there are places in Africa where human traffickers sell albino children and their body parts for use in magic rituals. Humanity Healing International is actively working in Uganda to change this paradigm. The Albino Rescue Project finds albino children who are at risk and places them in safe schools and environments where they can learn and grow free from fear. To learn more or to sponsor a child, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Circle of Hearts Radio is a sanctuary on the airwaves. Join me, Grandmother Elia, in the circle on Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern, as I share information to both enlighten and nourish your soul.
Hello, I'm John Lithgow. Manatees are unique, among the most amazing animals on Earth, but they're endangered. We pose the greatest threat to their survival. Many manatees are killed or injured by boats or other recreational activities. I'm a writer of children's books, including one about manatees, and I believe education is the key. You can be part of the solution. Please contact Save the Manatee Club right now. Call 1-800-432-JOIN. Thank you.
The number one reason girls drop out of school in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of access to feminine hygiene products. The Pads for Schoolgirls Project, an outreach of Humanity Healing International, is changing this paradigm by setting up sewing programs at schools, teaching girls a vocational skill, while producing the reusable pads that help keep them attending classes. The girls pay it forward by making and giving pad kits to other girls in need. To learn more, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
And we're back with Matthew Fox, author of A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation Spirituality Journey. What was Merton's position on feminism? We talked about Jesus being a feminist. What was Merton's position on feminism?
Well, of course, he died in 1968. So those were the early years of feminism, you might say. But he was reading feminists at the time, and he was in an amazing dialogue with Rosemary Ruther, who was only 29 years old, a young women theologian, feminist theologian, who taught at Howard University at that time. And they were writing letters back and forth. There was quite a correspondence that's now been published as a book. And Rosemary Ruther, whom I know quite well, was quite severe toward Merton, who was 50 years old at the time. So he was certainly twice her age practically. But but it's a very interesting correspondence, and Merton is very humble in it. He's asking for her help and her insight and her theology. So just that alone really stands out. But Merton also writes at length and very beautifully about the divine feminine, about the experience of night and prayer at night, and getting down on his knees to chant the Psalms and to be up when the stars are up and so forth. I mean, he talks about this being the maternal time. This is the feminine time and so forth. So he's seeking, and he's got a very big soul. And even though he was, what should I say, he was very grounded in his own sexuality, and he was heterosexual, he nevertheless was reaching out to take in the feminine. And also Rachel Carson's important book on ecology, which came out, I think, in 1962, Silent Spring, the first major book on ecology. She was fired immediately by her science department, kicked out of academia. They called her an hysterical woman in love with bunnies and trees. Well, Merton, quite the opposite, wrote her a 3-page letter and said, this is a marvelous and important book, and because of it, we're going to cease using DDT on our monastery farm, he said. And he went on and talked about how other changes that are needed on the farm because of her research and so forth. So there again, he's showing this this openness to women intellectuals. And I think that had he lived longer, of course, he would have been more active in the women's movement. But I think for a monk and heterosexual man in the 60s, he was way ahead of his time.
And he was a strong advocate for justice and freedom. How did he express that?
Well, one way was his standing up against the Vietnam War. And I actually believe that his death was not accidental. I believe that he was gunned down by the CIA. And I bring the evidence for this out in the book. And it's interesting because I've spoken to 2 CIA agents who were there in Southeast Asia at the time, which is where he died, in Bangkok. He died 3 hours after giving a talk to monks and nuns entitled Karl Marx and Monasticism. Well, that was not too wise in 1968 to give a public talk like that and to let people know that that was his title. After all, that's supposedly what we were doing in Vietnam, was stopping Marxism, and at least one version of it. Now, since the book came out, I've spoken to a 3rd CIA agent who was there in Southeast Asia, and he said yes. He says he thinks that we definitely killed Merton. Remember, he died the same year that Martin Luther King was murdered and the same year that Robert Kennedy was murdered. And so there was a lot of goings-on that were very dark and sinister at the time. One CIA agent said to me, he said, we were flooded with cash at that time, and there was absolutely no accountability whatsoever. He said any CIA agent who felt Merton was a threat to America could have had him done in with no questions asked.
Now, you mentioned Merton's defense of Rachel Carson. What was his overall position on our stewardship of this earth that we all share?
Oh, he was so strong about the sacredness of all beings. And what I call the cosmic Christ theology, that the Christ is present in all beings. So my last chapter, in fact, is on that very topic, where he says that everything that is holy. He says everything that is holy. And so, of course, he lived very close to the earth. That's how it was in a monastery at that time in Kentucky. It was a farming community, really, and he loved it. He loved that part of it, and he felt that he found God in creation. He says, God speaks to us gently in 10,000 things. He shines not on them, but from within them. It's a beautiful phrase. And that's the teaching of the cosmic Christ, or the Buddha nature, or the image of God, that all beings contain the presence of the divine within them, and they're busy shining and demonstrating that beauty. He says, life is this simple. We live in a world that is absolutely transparent. The divine is shining through it all the time. This is not just a nice story or a fable. It is true. And then he says, there's no way of telling people that they're all walking around shining like the sun. So these are beautiful teachings from Merton, and he applies them to all creatures. And as he said once, he said, every non-two-legged creature is a saint, which is another way of looking at a dog or a tree or a rock. Every non-two-legged creature is a saint. So he found holiness all around him. And so obviously the destruction of forests and the destruction of the soil and of other creatures, he complains about how the birds are disappearing. This is back in the 60s. He goes on about certain birds are no longer present on the farm anymore. And this is why I think he found Rachel Carson so right and so truthful, that she helped to explain what was going on, and it is the chemicals they've been putting into the earth and the waters and the air and the soil that are responsible for a lot of this death. And he was alert to it all.
So this is a path of and a theology of immanence rather than transcendence.
Well, that's right. Another word for it is panentheism, which says God is in all things and all things are in God. And that's altogether orthodox, if you will. You can't get burned at the stake for that. It's not the same as pantheism that says everything is God, but it's saying everything is in God and God is in everything. And that respects the surprise of God as well. It doesn't just lock down God to creation as we know it.
Whereas transcendence puts a separation between all of creation and God.
It can do that, and that's what theism does. Theism says, I'm here and God's out there someplace. And I think that's very dangerous, and unfortunately, a lot of organized religion still has people thinking that way. But panentheism is the mystical way of seeing the world. It's seeing the world as grace, that we're swimming in, it's like a fish in water. The water's in the fish, and the fish is in the water. So we are swimming in the grace of God, and the grace of God is swimming through us. I think that's a much more whole and adult way to see the world. It's a more holistic way. And it's interesting to go back to your original story about this mentor you had in her 80s,
yes,
who separated the holiness and the wholeness. Now I think we can bring it all together, that the wholeness is part of the holiness and the holiness is part of the wholeness.
Yeah. I think she was referring to holiness as defined by mainstream religion.
Yes, and in an anthropocentric way, you see, as if only humans are holy. But again, Merton and the whole Cosmic Christ tradition breaks through that and says all beings are holy. And that's the basis of an ecological revolution and the real movement that has to happen in human consciousness. If we're going to make the next step in our evolutionary journey, we have to recover the sacredness of our lives, the sacredness of being, the sacredness of the earth, and act accordingly.
What message would Thomas Merton deliver to our world today?
Well, I love one passage where he says, he's writing to himself in his journal, and he says, "You idiot, start dancing." He said, "You idiot, start dancing. What are you doing just sitting around? You should be dancing because life is such a banquet, and life is so beautiful." And I think that's what he would say. You idiots, quit destroying this banquet and stomping on it, start dancing and celebrating it and sharing it. And that's what justice is about. It's about inviting more people to the celebration.
And how do we start seeing that divine in everything in each other?
Well, there is an emptying process, of course, and that's silence. The scriptures say, "Be still and learn that I am God." So there is this need to still the human heart. And what I would call the reptilian brain. I think that science helps us here. If we can calm that reptilian brain, which is 420 million years old in all of us, then the mammal brain, which is half as old, 210 million years, this is a compassionate brain, the brain of kinship and friends and family. Then the compassionate brain can assert itself. And then the recent brain, the neocortex, which is our brain that makes us so dangerous and also so intelligent, then this could operate more out of compassion and less out of the reptilian brain that we see manifest everywhere, whether it's in the ISIS and the wars and the militarism that we're spending our money on, or whether it's in this presidential election that we're stumbling through. The reptilian brain is front and center, and it's really embarrassing. And humanity has to pay more attention to the compassionate brain, the mammal brain. And this is not just a a Jewish thing or a Christian thing, the Dalai Lama says we can do away with all religion, but we can't do away with compassion.
Absolutely.
And the Quran, too, calls Allah the compassionate one more than any other name for Allah. It is the compassionate one. So compassion is a universal teaching. And all these teachers are trying to tell us, wake up, shake it out, and take care of that reptilian brain so that compassion can finally strut its stuff.
And Merton's message to humanity, if he were here today, would be get out there and get dancing. What's Matthew Fox's personal message to our world today?
Well, launch out into the deep. Don't be afraid to go deep and to live religion at the level of experience, not at the level of just dogmas and rote and memorized shibboleths. Live it at the level of experience.
Feel it within yourself. Know that it's part of you and you are part of it.
Yes, it's like the psalmist says, taste and see that God is good. You have
Wonderful.
to taste it. No one can do it for you.
The wisdom of our wonderful guest, Matthew Fox, author of the new book, A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation Spirituality Journey. Matthew, please tell our listeners how they can get your book and find out more about you.
Yes, go to www.matthewfox.org. That's 2 T's. And you can get the book in bookstores or on Amazon and so forth. New World Library publishes it, but you can get it through my organization as well, and Creation Spirituality. That would be available on my webpage as well, matthewfox.org.
Thank you, and we'd love to have you on again really soon.
Thank you, Victor. I really appreciate an intelligent program like yours and the good questions.
Thank you, sir. And this is Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor the Voice Furman. Thank you for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful week.